Yeah, so I'm going to speak maybe faster than usual because I'm trying to condense 45 minutes into 25 minutes and discarding my meticulously prepared speech. That's actually a joke. Thank you for laughing. Actually, no, I've just been here all day yesterday picking up these different threads and feeling really good to be here because ordinarily so much of what I have to exert tremendous effort to establish in an audience speaking around the climate change issue, people already get it here. So I'm feeling like I'm with my people. So yeah, awesome to be here. I was so moved by many things yesterday. And one of them I'll just mention at the beginning was in the storytelling panel, the way that the meat issue was held, I thought was really beautiful because it's one of the most polarizing issues out there. Like probably about half of the hate mail I get is from vegans. And like letters that start with "shame on you, Charles." And so this is like an example of what I think is actually the biggest crisis facing humanity right now. It's not climate change, it's polarization. Because if our society is polarized, if we're spending 99% of our energy fighting each other, then there's not going to be much left to change the course of the ship of state. We have to be in coherence for that to happen. So one thing so what I appreciated about the meat conversation is the understanding that the real issue is something that neither side of the polarized debate is actually talking about. It's that they're asking the wrong question. The wrong question, the question isn't, should you eat meat or shouldn't you eat meat? Or is meat good or bad? It's the question of how. How is it grown? And maybe the real question isn't meat versus not meat, but it's industrial agriculture versus ecological agriculture. So this principle I apply to any polarized debate. The idea that in any polarized debate, the most important issue is what neither side is talking about. It's the hidden agreements that both sides share that may not be true, and it's the questions that neither side asks. So I want to put out there the idea that the climate change debate or the global warming debate is another example of this, that it is the wrong debate, and that the most important thing is what neither side, at least conventionally speaking, is talking about. That the primary focus of this conversation should not be carbon dioxide or greenhouse gases. What would be an alternative, or what would be a larger frame to contain it? It's what I've been working with in my research and writing. I call it the living Earth paradigm. Basically, it says that this planet is alive, and that's not a metaphor, but it is a living being, and its organs are the forests, the wetlands, the water, the soil, especially the soil, the species, the ecosystems, the whales, the fish, the insects. All of these are organs of a living being. And that just as in your body, if your organs were being degraded over time, and if each of your organs had only 10% of its cells left, you would have a lot of trouble maintaining your overall homeostasis. You would have trouble maintaining your climate. And this is what's happening on Earth today. J.B. McKinnon, the Canadian naturalist, says we live in a 10% world. It's a poetic statistic, but he gives all these examples of the former abundance of life on Earth. The cod schools so thick that they were an impediment to shipping. The whales that we're probably at 5 or 10% of the number of whales that there used to be. How much of the virgin forest is remaining in North America? About 1%. 20% of the insects, half the mangrove swamps, et cetera, et cetera. So this is actually what's been happening. Climate change has been happening for thousands of years, going back to the deforestation of Mesopotamia, the deforestation of the Greek islands, destruction of the Loess Plateau in China and elsewhere. And the reason for it, and this predates industry and fossil fuels, the reason has been the destruction of land, the draining of wetlands, the tillage of soil, the cutting down of forests all over the world. And I think that where climate change began is the best place for climate change to end: agriculture. So it's come out again and again here that from the paradigm that I call carbon fundamentalism or carbon reductionism, or let's just say the standard narrative of greenhouse gases causing runaway global warming, from that perspective, regenerative agriculture is already extremely important and is maybe the Hail Mary pass. Maybe it's the only feasible solution. Certainly a lot easier than changing the entire fossil fuel economy. Hey, we can sequester lots of carbon. From the living earth perspective, soil regeneration is even more important because the soil is a critical organ of Gaia. And I don't have to go through a lot of the science in this room. People understand how healthy soils that are present in grasslands, in forests, and in well-tended agricultural land, how they anchor the global hydrological system, how they ameliorate the flood-drought cycle, how they can prevent many of the things that we attribute to climate change from happening. So every time something gets blamed on climate change, I always ask, is this just an enactment of a common pattern of our civilization, which is anytime there's a problem, you find the one thing that's causing the problem. Oh, forest fires in California, that must be climate change. Floods in southern Texas, that must be climate change. Immigration, that's definitely being caused by climate change. The collapse of the disappearance of the rains in Central America and Indonesia and other places, that must be caused by climate change, which is, sorry I'm talking so fast, which is a cipher for global warming caused by greenhouse gases. But a lot of times it's because of the destruction of forests, which then no longer exercise the biotic pump function, which I hope I don't have to explain here. The way that forests draw water in from the oceans and stabilize the entire global flow of fluids. Forests are more of a heart than a lung for the planet, and the soil does the same thing. So yeah, where did we get this idea that there's one thing that we could change that would solve all of our problems? The one important thing. It's the mindset of fundamentalism. It's the mindset of war. It's the mindset of money. The one thing that if you only had enough of it, if you could only fix this one thing, everything would be solved. So I guess I'm happy enough that soil is getting its just due, that it's getting more attention from the carbon sequestration perspective. But I have some concerns about that. Because for one thing, when we reduce soil, when we say, okay, let's regenerate the soil because of global warming, because it can draw down this single substance, carbon, that is the key to solving all of our problems. When we say that, we're actually making soil less important than it really is. And we're only encouraging practices that we can demonstrate draw down carbon. Now, those practices might very well be the very best thing for this particular microclimate or for this particular piece of land here and now. But what if they're not? What if the regime of carbon metrics leads us to do things that aren't actually in service to the land here and now where we are? What if basing policy and incentives on carbon metrics encourages things like I don't know, I mean, biochar is probably another polarizing issue, at least in these circles. But there are, but it encourages those practices that most easily create good metrics. And we saw in the soil panel yesterday that it's actually really hard to measure soil carbon because, like, what depth do you measure it, and what form is the carbon in? Is it in, there's many forms that soil carbon can take, some of which only stay in the soil for a short while before they get oxidized and return to the atmosphere. Others could be there for decades or even centuries or even permanently. So how do you distinguish all of those things? And what about the, so from a living Earth perspective, as in any shift of perspective, you see different things. You see things that are invisible from a reductionistic perspective. So one of the biggest benefits of, in my mind, of regenerative agriculture is that it rebuilds biodiversity, which allows the Gaian physiology to function better. And this is really hard to measure or to reduce to carbon metrics. I had a conversation with an Uber driver, and he was like, well, what about the trace minerals? Like, what do you do about trace minerals in regenerative agriculture? Aren't you exporting, when you're producing food, aren't you exporting those? How do you get those back? And my mind went to the global transport system for minerals, which involves megafauna migration and bird migration patterns. If you don't have the free migration of, or like bird populations have declined by 30% in my lifetime in North America. So if you don't have birds that transport nutrients from the ocean overland and they release their droppings onto the land, then over time your soil is going to degrade no matter how careful you are. Or if you don't have salmon swimming upriver on the West Coast, and this I'm sure used to be true in the East Coast too, to spawn because they're being blocked by dams, then they're not carrying marine nutrients inland, which when they get eaten by bears and the bears poop in the woods, they nourish the trees and make them less vulnerable to disease and fire. Like this is all part of a physiology of a living being. Or someone also was mentioning yesterday that the ambient humidity in California used to be a lot higher because of these microclimates and these old growth forests that also maintain the flow of fluids. I think I should just rest for a moment here. Yeah, I have to say, I'm a little bit skeptical, or a little bit, my hackles raise when I'm confronted with a war narrative around climate change or a Hail Mary narrative. I get the basic urgency underneath it, that, and this is what I spoke at Extinction Rebellion in Berlin and said something like this. I said, like, what this is really coming from is a recognition that the way we are living is unacceptable, and I don't want to participate in this. I want to change this. And this wrongness, it goes so deep that we generally don't even know what it is. So then something comes up as a channel to express our fundamental dissatisfaction with the story and the system that governs civilization. But I said to the Extinction Rebellion folks, I said, if global warming weren't happening, if temperatures started to drop, if the skeptics are right, if we're approaching another solar minimum that lets in so that I don't know if you guys know all. I mean, there's like many different universes of thinking about climate change. The idea that a grand solar minimum is approaching, and when that happens, the sun's magnetosphere weakens and more cosmic rays come in, stimulating cloud formation and cooling the Earth. And they talk about how the temperatures were much, much higher in the early Holocene than they are today. You know, the tree line was hundreds of kilometers north of where it is now, et cetera, et cetera. And okay, whatever. Like, again, the wrong debate. The wrong debate. But if they were right, I said, if they're right, you'd still be here. Because global warming, as we conceive it right now, is a symptom of a much deeper malady. It's our basic relationship to the Earth. And the solution to climate change is not that we become a little bit more clever in how we produce energy so that we can power civilization as we have known it, with low carbon, zero carbon fuels instead of fossil fuels, as we continue to turn the Earth into one gigantic strip mine, parking lot, and waste dump. That's not the revolution that we are in. We're not going to have any fundamental change by being more clever in how we extract and dispose. The transition is from domination to participation, to see ourselves, to see our purpose, not as the story of separation that holds us separate from the world, from nature, from each other, not as it narrated that our glorious destiny is to rise above nature and become its lords and possessors, but that we, as all species, are here in service to life. That our purpose here is to participate in the coming more alive of the world and of the universe, just like every other species. And that in an ecosystem, we know this. Looking at soil, we know this, that if one species is depleted or exterminated, everybody is worse off. Everybody has a gift to give toward the maintenance of the whole and toward the evolution of the whole. It's not that they're all in competition, and if you got rid of the fungi, then the bacteria would be better off. Or if you got rid of one bacteria, then the others would be better off. We're supposed to be part of that too. And this crisis that we are calling climate change will not go away until we accept that. And so from that lens, from the living earth, living soil, living forest, not a collection of trees, living forest, from the living earth lens, we look for different things. And if there is some being that we don't understand why it's so important, and maybe we could do without it, like the sea turtles, for example. Do they have anything to do with soil health? I don't think anybody here knows what they have to do with soil health. Or how about bears? Are they important for the health of your agricultural lands? I don't know how they are, but I know that they are, just as I know that every organ and every tissue in my body is important, even if science may not understand yet why. Like the bears, maybe it's like, as Paul Stamets says, they scratch the trees to mark their territory, and in their scratches a certain kind of fungus grows that grows nowhere else. And this fungus is very attractive to bees and other pollinators. And it turns out that this fungus secretes a substance that protects against colony collapse disorder. So because of the bears, the insects are healthier, and maybe without them, then other opportunistic species of insects proliferate and cause these outbreaks, and who knows how that ends up affecting soil. But we know that it does. So just as okay, from that perspective, the first step ever in an interaction with the world, and this came up too, is to ask, well, what does this place want? What does it want to be, and how can I participate in that? What does the soil want? What does this place want? What does the forest want? To even ask that question is already revolutionary. To ascribe wants or purpose or a destiny, a teleology to what has been believed to be a non-sentient being, that already is to turn the worldview that we inherited upside down. And it's the right kind of question to ask. So it begins with listening, begins with observation, and then comes participation. How do we grow up as a species and turn our gifts to service of life? Whereas, in a way, we've been kind of playing in the sandbox, like children. We, meaning the dominant culture. This is not a linear progression. The new story that I'm talking about is also a very ancient story. The new story of co-creation, the new story of interbeing. But that's what an adult does. An adult seeks to turn his or her gifts towards service, to something greater than oneself. I'll just jump to one more thing here. It's just being brought up by this very cold weather. You know, there's record cold happening in Australia right now, too. This year, there's been record cold and record heat all over the place. And I wrote an article about this called Why I'm Afraid of Global Cooling. Not necessarily because it's not that I reject climate science, although in my research I became a bit more skeptical of it than I had been when I started. But it's that we as environmentalists and as regenerative farmers, I would say, regenerative people, have hitched our wagon to the climate change horse. When we give the reason, because it will sequester carbon for everything that we do, what happens if that narrative falls apart? And how do we even present it to the half of the population that has been polarized onto the other side of the issue, whether they're right or not? Phil Taylor gave me some really good examples of that. They work with Midwest farmers on the high plains who they don't believe in climate change. They voted for Donald Trump. They're conservative. They're evangelical. But you don't need to convince them that global warming is real in order for them to accept, to want to heal the soil, to want to live in a place where they can drink the water again from the well that granddaddy or great-granddaddy dug. They want the soil to be alive. They want the birds to come back. They want the springs to flow again. All of the things that make us fall in love with the earth apply to everybody. And so I was like, first, isn't it risky to put all of our eggs in the climate change basket? Second, is it necessary even to do that when there's a maybe even more compelling reason to practice, to engage in regenerative practices? And then there's one more thing. Let's call it love. When I've been an environmentalist my whole life, like back at least to the age of 7, when I learned about the passenger pigeons. And then I remember seeing the footage of the oil spills in the 1970s, the seabirds staggering on the beach, coated with oil. And I wanted it to stop. and the deforestation of the Amazon. There was a piece in National Geographic in 1980 with the maps and the shrinking Amazon. And I wanted it to stop. And then climate change came on the scene. And like many environmentalists, I thought, good. Now they're going to have to change. All the things that I've wanted them to do, now they're going to have to. And I can offer them, like I was already thinking in these terms in the 1980s. I thought, now we, the environmentalists, can offer them a self-interested reason why they have to stop. It's no longer save the whales because they are so magnificent. Save the forest because it's so beautiful. We don't have to appeal to love anymore. We can appeal to fear. We can appeal to the possibility of human extinction. Here are the bad things that are going to happen: economic losses, mass migration, the sea level rising 50 feet, and so forth. Do it or else. I think that was a mistake, to move from a love narrative to a fear narrative, for several reasons. One of which is that if you're really appealing to self-interest as the reason to make the changes, well, unfortunately, what's really in your self-interest is for everybody else to make the changes and not you, or for every other city to do it and not yours, or every other country to do it and not yours. When you're strengthening the basic field of self-interest, that's the kind of results that you're going to get. Secondly, this mindset is what's at the root of the problem to begin with. The mindset of nature is valuable because of what it offers humanity, rather than valuable in its own right. Valuable in its own right, that only makes sense if it is a being. And we have lived in a scientific story that does not assign beingness to anything but human beings. Full beingness, full sentience, consciousness, and so forth. Like I might say, well, I'm going to take really good care of my cell phone. But it's not because I love it as a being. It's because it's useful to me. That's why I'm not going to leave it out in the snow. But I'm not going to take any better care of it than is warranted by its service to myself. So if we see nature in that instrumental way, we're not going to take we're going to take just good enough care of it to meet the needs that we can foresee, to bring the benefits that we can predict and control, and know better. The third thing about the fear narrative, and I think this might be the biggest trap of all, is that people don't actually believe it. What people believe is what we've learned from experience, not only in our lifetimes, but for thousands of years. Our experience has been that as the world dies, as the forests die, as the fish die, we're going to be fine. We've been fine. Climate change or ecocide is not something that just started in the industrial era. You know, the Greek islands used to be fully forested. They weren't like these barren landscapes of boulders and things. The Mediterranean was surrounded by wetlands. Iraq, Saudi Arabia, I mean, there were wetlands there. There were lions. There were forests. The cedars of Lebanon. I mean, the world was so much more alive, and with each generation it becomes a little bit more dead. And we're fine, at least in the ways that we measure. The number of people, lifespan, per capita GDP. I mean, everything has been going up and up and up in the last, especially the last 100 years, even as the world is, as the dying of the world has accelerated. How is that going to change? Experience has taught us that we'll be fine. Actually, we're not fine. We're only fine in what we can measure, or what we choose to measure. That's the problem with basing policy on metrics, because it only incorporates what you can measure, what is most easily measurable, what you think is worth measuring, or what is even fundamentally measurable. Isn't there anything to life that isn't measurable that's important? Aren't there qualitative things? The ideology of science says everything is measurable. The ideology of economics says everything that is worth anything can be converted to a linear scale of value. The many can become one. Values can become value through the mechanism of the marketplace. But this is an ideology. And as we create a world with more and more and more of the measurable, more and more and more of the quantitative, we suffer a growing poverty of all the things that we cannot measure. And the result is, for example, skyrocketing rates of suicide, depression, addiction. This is the result of the inner mirror of all that has been destroyed, of all the relationships that have been truncated, of all the beings that have been extinguished. It's an inner poverty because we are not actually separate selves that can insulate ourselves from the world. We are inter-beings. And what we do to the world, we do in some form to ourselves, but it doesn't mean that when we destroy nature, we die. It's not that simple. It's that something in us dies, that we become less. So people do not believe their lived experience of generations says we're going to be fine. And we have all kinds of technology to make that true. We have in vitro meat technology where we don't need the soil, we don't need cows, we don't need any other life forms, we can grow it in vats. We have hydroponics factories that are touted as the solution to climate change or a response to climate change. We don't need the soil anymore. What if we could continue on that road? What if the next generation will have an Earth that's 10% or half again more dead than this world is, and another generation even more dead? But we have hydroponics factories and meat-growing plantations and carbon-sucking machines, and we bleach the sky white with sulfur aerosols to reflect sunlight. And we have VR displays of all the dead nature for aesthetic comfort. Like, what's going to stop that from happening? Because that's what we've been choosing as a civilization for a very long time. With each generation, we have constantly made the choice for more death. What's going to have to change? I think what has to change is first to recognize that the planet is alive and that it is a being so that we can love this being, that we can see it as alive. So it's an ideological change, and it's also a recovery of our ability to feel. As one of the Kogi said, looking at the destruction of the coastal wetlands of Colombia, he said, if you knew she could feel, you would stop. And so maybe what will bring people into this movement is to connect them with their felt, with their love of place, with their love of land, with their love of life, and not to scare them into change with a story that they don't even believe, and which might not even be true. And okay, before anyone calls me a climate denier, let me just say that I do think that we should reduce fossil fuel emissions. I think that I don't think that we're necessarily facing global warming or runaway tipping points, but with a seriously degraded organ system, seriously degraded, this planet is not very well able to handle additional challenges, such as the greater thermodynamic throughput that's caused by rising greenhouse gases. So I do think it's important. It's the fourth priority in my mind. First priority being, I'll be done soon. I'm good. Okay. First priority, from the living Earth perspective, the first priority is conservation, to preserve any pristine ecosystems that still exist, especially the Amazon and the Congo, but also anything that is still has life in it, in its full expression. Because, I mean, I could give you the scientific reasons why, about how the Amazon anchors the global hydrological cycle, but also simply because this is where Gaia's memory of health still exists intact. Some of you who study soil are beginning to appreciate just how alive and how complex it is, and how subtle the contributions are of all beings and how interconnected everything is. Like coral reefs are dying all over the world. Part of the reason is the soil. There's an intimate link between forests and coral reefs. When the forests are cut down, the soil washes into the ocean, and the whole cascade of changes happens. So, number one priority, conservation. Second priority is regeneration, and that's why we're here. It's to bring health back to the dying organs. And here we're talking mostly about the soil. So it's the soil, the wetlands, the forests, the water, the species. Marine preserves would be an example of how to do that. Yeah, to restore these organs. Third priority is to stop dousing the planet in poison. Pesticides, herbicides, fungicides, toxic waste, pharmaceutical residues that weaken the Gaian physiology on a tissue level. I was amazed by just how much spraying. The entire state of Rhode Island, where I live, has recently been sprayed to combat the EEE virus. Excuse my sarcasm, but yeah, somebody died from it. Okay, so that's no joke. But like this pattern of find something to kill as a solution to every problem. Find an enemy. So, okay, let's kill the mosquitoes. Well, okay, aren't you actually also going to be killing the dragonflies and the birds and the bats that are up on the food chain, and you're going to have even more mosquitoes next year, and Lord knows what else? Well, that's not really on the conversation table. But yeah, so to stop dousing the world in poison. And the fourth priority, for me, and it's a distant fourth actually, is to cut fossil fuel emissions. But that would happen as a result of the other ones. Like you cannot hold every place sacred and continue to frack and to drill and to strip mine and to tar sand, to excavate and to do all these things. So that would be a natural result of holding Earth as alive and sacred. That is the transition that we are facing. It's to hold the world as sacred again. Thank you for doing that. And I guess that's all I need to say.